Hi guys, and welcome. In this video I want to show you how I, with no boat building experience, built a 14-foot wooden boat. Along the way I'll share 5 tips with you that will save you hours of time, frustration, and money if you're considering building your own boat. But first let me do a quick intro about how I got to this point. So do you guys have a life bucket list? You know, one of those lists that has really awesome things on it that you want to do throughout your life. So one of my list items was to learn how to sail. I've always loved boats, being on the water, but I've never had a chance to learn to sail. And another thing about me is I really like designing and building things. So one day, and I don't remember what triggered this in my brain, but I had a crazy thought, you know, why not build a sailboat? So back in 2007, I spent time researching wooden boats and the boat building process. And unfortunately, this was way before my journey into videos and YouTube. However, I did document it by taking still pictures, and I will share that with you today in this video. So if you do a quick search in Google, you can find a lot of boat plans available. After looking at the plans and looking into the boat building process, I was a little hesitant to make the jump into this huge project. The process of building a boat was completely new to me, and the sailboat plans that I was looking at were kind of overwhelming. So I did some more research, and after reading a lot of experiences from other boat builders, I decided that the best plan for me was to build something smaller and easier to first learn the boat building process myself. So this brings me to tip number 1. Build something easy first to learn the process. Sounds kind of basic, but it will help you in the long run as you're going through this for yourself. Plus, it's a smaller investment to find out if you really enjoy it and if you have what it takes to build a boat. So for me, that meant building a 14-foot rowboat. It's quite a step down from building a big sailboat, but that's what I needed to do, I think. And for you, maybe you're confident enough to go for the nice fishing boat, or maybe a speedboat, or maybe a small canoe or a kayak would be better for you. The build process I chose to build my boat is called stitch and glue. Basically, you stitch plywood parts together with wires or zip ties, and then once that's set together where you need it, then you glue the joints with epoxy and a wood flour glue. So I purchased my boat plans from boatbuildercentral.com, and I also bought my fiberglass and marine epoxy from them. They were really good to work with, and they have a forum on their site where other builders can post their experiences, and this was very helpful in my case. So that's how I got to this point. So let's dive in and build a boat. So I sourced some lumber from a dealer locally that sells marine plywood. It's mahogany and rot resistant. It's not very cheap, but I wanted my boat to last for a long time. And since it was winter time when I started this build, I needed somewhere to build that was warm enough for the epoxy to cure, and that was definitely not my garage. My garage basically averages around freezing for 4 months out of the winter time. What I did was I cleaned out a space in my basement. From there, the build was on. So just a side note here, I was playing with different sailboat plans, and you can see the footprint of one of those in this picture that I had taped out on the floor. So the first task was to mark and cut out the parts. To get the longer parts, I had to tape 2 pieces of plywood together. And for the curved parts, I tapped in nails just enough so that I could use them as guides, and then I used some PVC pipe as a straight edge to mark the lines. You can use any straight edge really that's flexible enough to make a smooth curve. After cutting all the parts, I joined the two side pieces with a butt joint. I covered the joint with another piece of ply that's then glued across it. The glue is made by mixing a batch of epoxy and then adding wood flour to it until it's about the consistency of peanut butter. So tip number 2, when working with epoxy wood flour glue, you should not apply it directly to the dry wood. If you do, the wood will suck epoxy from the glue and the joint will not be as strong as it should. So first apply a coat of clear epoxy to the wood where you're going to apply the glue, and this will give you a much stronger joint. With the sides butted together, the next step was to start attaching the frames. I was having a hard time getting the sides to come together as they should. My 10-year-old son said, "Dad, you have it upside down." And he was right. So finally, I was able to move forward. All my kids are smarter than I am, really. So in this picture, you can see the stitches that are holding the bow together. It's nice to see this when it starts looking like a boat. And in this pic, you can see all the frames stitched into place. Stitching the bottom onto the sides. And here I put duct tape in between the stitches so that when I flipped the boat over and glued the inside joints, the glue wouldn't squeeze through. I also put in some temporary screws to hold the frame in place until they're all glued in place. So here it is flipped, and the next step was to glue the internal seams with the wood flour glue. Remember to apply the coat of plain epoxy to the wood in places where you're going to glue first. When all the seams between the zip ties have been glued and cured, you can snip off the zip ties and then finish gluing those sections together. At this point, you've reached a significant milestone in the project. The joints are glued, frames are glued in place, and it's fairly solid. I then move forward fiberglassing all the joints I had just glued. This reinforces the joints and makes the whole thing rock solid. There is a learning curve for this if you've never worked with fiberglass before. I'll give you my brain dump of everything I learned along the way. As you can see from this picture of my first joints, it can be very messy. I used rolled fiberglass tape about 6 inches wide. It's not actually tape with an adhesive side. It is strips of fiberglass held together with cotton strings. The idea is to wet out the fiberglass with epoxy and stick it in place. Then after it's dried, you sand down the cotton strings that are thicker than the fiberglass and stand a little higher. Since mostly it's impossible to get the fiberglass to lay flat over a 90-degree angle, or any sharp angle really for that matter, I had to lay down what is called a fillet of wood flour glue in the joint first. If you've ever done caulking around a sink or a tub, it's similar to that. The difference is that the radius is bigger, about a 3/4 inch radius. And this will allow the fiberglass to lay nicely from one side of the joint to the other. So this brings us to tip number 3. To make your fillets go on easier, after you mix up a batch of epoxy wood flour glue, put it in a plastic kitchen storage bag, like a Ziploc or some other bag. Snip off one of the bottom corners so that you have about a 1/2 inch hole, and you can squeeze the glue from this bag like decorating a cake with frosting. And this will make your fillets go on much smoother. And while we're talking about fillets, tip number 4, Plan to apply the fiberglass tape over the fillets while they are still green. Green meaning that they have not totally cured. Even better, do it while they're still a bit wet. This will save you many hours of sanding. So what I'm suggesting is that you plan how many joints you can get done in a specific work session. And by done, I mean 3 different layers applied one after another while it's all green. This requires a bit of planning, but it will save you hours and hours of sanding time. So after taping all the inside joints, I moved on to the rub rails. These go along the top outside edges of both sides of the boat. I chose to use 3 layers of the same plywood that the boat was built with. This made a nice 3/4 inch rail. You could use other materials as well, like solid 1x4 lumber ripped down to size. The plywood was just a lot easier to bend around the curve. And this was applied with the wood flour glue and clamped until cured. Thinking back, if I decided to go with clear coat for the final finish, I probably would have used the solid lumber. It would have made a nice looking contrast to the dark mahogany wood. So tip number 5, you can never have enough clamps, which I didn't. Make cheap clamps out of plastic drain pipe. I learned this trick from an old boat builder, with much more experience than I had. Take a piece of 4-inch plastic drain pipe and cut it lengthwise from end to end. Then cut it into pieces about 3 inches wide. These will provide just enough pressure when clamped on your rub rail, and you can see them in these pictures here. This picture is looking down onto the bow where the rub rails come together. I'm sure there are much more graceful ways for this joint to come together, but this is how mine ended up. Use an angle grinder to shape the point after it's all cured. Epoxy wood flour grinds and sands very smoothly, and you will find that an angle grinder will be your best friend during this build. At this point, you've reached another milestone, so celebrate your success and get ready for the final steps to complete the outside of the hull. So the weather had warmed by this time, and I decided to move the operation to my garage to avoid all the sanding dust that was coming up next. I flipped the boat upside down again and prepared it to apply fiberglass. I wanted to cover the entire bottom and up about halfway on the sides with fiberglass to give it the added protection. Once it was flipped, I had to round off the chines of the hull. So that's the joint where the bottom meets the sides. This is needed for the same reason that I made fillets on the inside joints, so that the fiberglass can lay nice around the joint. I used an angle grinder to round these over. It worked amazingly well. And then I followed that up with a random orbital sander to smooth it out. This pic shows the hull after I had applied a coat of the clear epoxy to seal it up prior to the fiberglass cloth. After seeing how nice the mahogany wood looked with just the epoxy, I almost decided not to fiberglass and paint the hull. But I wanted the extra protection, so I did it anyway. I failed to get a lot of pics during this phase of the work. I added a skeg to the hull to help it track straight, and then I applied the fiberglass cloth. The cloth is applied in a similar way as the fiberglass tape on the inside, except it holds together better when wetting it out with the epoxy. This picture is after the cloth was applied and some sanding done. You can see the darker areas on the hull are where the fiberglass was applied. Next, I used fairing compound to smooth the surface and get it ready for paint. This is a multiple step process of applying fairing compound, sanding, applying more fairing, more sanding, applying more fairing, and more sanding. The more you do, the better the final finish will look, but it's up to you when to say it's good enough. Once I made that decision, I applied a final coat of clear epoxy, let it cure, and then a light sanding. I chose to roll on the paint mostly because I didn't have a good sprayer, but I think spraying would give it a better finish. I applied a couple coats of high build primer, sanding in between each one, and then a couple coats of a 2-part marine enamel for the top finish paint. After that dried, I flipped it one last time. I added the seat tops and some miscellaneous parts to customize it a bit, and then all that inside fiberglass tape work that needed to be sanded and faired just like I did on the outside of the hull. I added a final coat of epoxy to every surface on the inside, and then it was primer and the finish coats of the paint. This pic shows where I taped off the inside bottoms so I could add some non-slip paint there. And finally, the finished boat ready for launch. At the boat ramp, I learned that the boat actually floats, and the trailer actually floats too when you forget that the boat is strapped to it. I'm happy with the way it turned out. It rows great and it tracks well. I've spent many days on the mountain lakes, dunking a hook in the water and pretending to fish. Hopefully you guys found this video insightful and helpful for one of your future projects. If so, please click the thumbs up link below and consider subscribing to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the upcoming DIY episodes. Thanks again for watching.